I have an impossibly sore neck. So if I scream out with pain and forget to turn off my microphone, it will be because I have just turned in an inappropriate direction. But John Allison, there are so many things I realize I want to ask you. Since you modestly emailed me and said, what are we going to talk about this morning? And I gave you some ideas. I've realized since that, well, writing about a thing you love, you've disappeared for me, but I think you're still there. Writing about a thing you love, it's just such, well, I'm not going to, I won't go straight for the themes. I'm going to start at the beginning. John, how did, this sounds so banal, pardon me. How did you become interested in opera?
Goodness, that goes back quite a long way, and I'll try and summarize. But first of all, just to say, it's wonderful to be talking to you about these things, because there's so much, I think, so much to cover. And I also think that, well, it's not just the current situation that shows this. I've always felt this for a long time, that we're all in this together, all in this horrible word, business, whatever you want to call it. And we all approach it from different directions, whether it's artists or administrators or critics, or maybe I should use the word reviewer rather than critic, because critic can be quite a negative word, I suppose. I've written about music and opera because I think of opera as part of music, and I enjoy writing about concerts a lot as well. I've written about music and opera for a long time, but it's not something in which there is really much of a career structure, to be honest. So finally getting into it professionally, it takes a mixture of luck and persistence. Of course, I was interested in opera long before I started writing. I grew up in Cape Town, and most of my first operatic experiences, all my first operatic experiences were in the opera in Cape Town. They had some wonderful artists coming there who, goodness knows, and I'm not sure I approve, but were obviously breaking various boycotts to get there, but nevertheless, interesting, important, wonderful artists, a lot of good work being produced locally. And I suppose I was about 10 when my mother decided, first got it into her head to take us all off to the opera. My brother and I, and my father. It was Falstaff, actually. And I can remember it very clearly. Obviously, it was sung in Italian in those days, and no subtitles or anything. I couldn't say I knew exactly what was going on, but I remembered the music. Until then, and even after that, I suppose my first passion was the piano, which I was studying quite obsessively. But I went to a lot of operas, interesting ones. My second opera ever was La Pericole, which is quite collectible, and I haven't seen it many times since then. And I'm going to cut the story short in a moment, but also just to say, I really remember being very young and going to Fidelio and realizing that on Robben Island, which was only about 10 kilometers away, that sort of scenario was playing out. And yet I got the feeling that a lot of the people in the audience were treating it just as a good evening's entertainment. Well, admittedly, uplifting, very uplifting, magnificent music. But nobody was actually talking. Of course, I can't tell you what they were thinking, but nobody was really talking about the parallels. And for me, Fidelio has always remained one of my favorite operas, possibly also because of my interest in piano music and obviously in Beethoven. But so it was quite something to go back. In 2004, I went back to Cape Town when they did Fidelio on Robben Island in the prison courtyard, which created all sorts of logistical problems. But and it was an imperfect performance in some ways. But to have it there in the courtyard, they cut the dialogue and played from tannoy speakers some key Mandela speeches. So it was one way of doing it. I would say that the early performances in Cape Town did shape me, but the first thing I ever saw at ETO when I was visiting London as a student was the famous David Alden chainsaw Mazeppa, which absolutely thrilled me because I was interested in Russian opera, but also I thought, gosh, this must be the house style of ETO, and that was quite exciting. Those were early experiences.
And when you say that opera in Cape Town shaped you, or opera in South Africa shaped you, can you just describe that shaping? I mean, even in terms of whether there was a hero for you in opera, or what was the experience that you had as a young person going to opera? What did you make of it? What did you think it could offer you?
Well, I admit I came to it probably at that stage more from the musical than the dramatic side. I mean, I was obsessed with music. I came to it from that side, and I suppose I've learned about drama on the job. I like focusing on music and writing about music. It was the music, and just certain performances absolutely stayed in my mind, and I would say that was probably for musical reasons. Maybe you could say the productions were relatively conventional too, but nothing wrong with that. But the music stayed with me. I suppose I listened to a lot of recordings actually as well. That was as much a part of the shaping. I mean, I didn't go to the opera all the time. There might have only been sort of half a dozen, 8, 10 productions a year, and I probably didn't see them all. I certainly didn't see them all. So I was listening to a lot of recordings, but I've always been a little bit repertoire driven in my mind. I'm still a nerd, and I'm interested in obscure pieces, perhaps, or pieces that fit together in some interesting context. When I travel now for performances, well, I go for all sorts of reasons, but I think I still go when the piece interests me rather than who's singing. I hugely admire lots of wonderful singers and lots of stars, and I'm happy to hear them. But that's not, to be honest, my first motivation. If I go somewhere, it will be because there's a wonderful obscure Martinu or Moniuszko opera or something, one of my pet pieces.
But I just want to skirt around repertoire
Yes.
longer. Tell me about, if you would, who made it? I mean, was it a part of the culture of the home? Or was it something, I know your mother brought you, was it something that you particularly asked for? I'm trying to find out in a way, was there someone who influenced you to make you think it was possible for opera to play a role in your life?
I suppose it was my mother, but I actually, opera became a more dominant part of my life later. I mean, until the time I left university, and then, in fact, as soon as I'd finished all my studies, I came over here to avoid the military conscription in South Africa. I came over here not quite knowing exactly what I was going to do, and certainly not an opera specialist at that point. Opera was a big part of musical life, but it wasn't that. So, but really, I guess it was my mother's record collection, actually. And then I suppose I got it into my head more or less out of the blue that I would like to learn the piano. We didn't have a piano at home, and my parents generously got one. And I thought, well, if he didn't make anything of it, could get rid of it again later. And also because I started the piano lessons slightly later than most people, and because I wasn't forced into it by pushy parents, I developed quite fast, and it was something I realized I was quite decent at, and so therefore I enjoyed it, and therefore I worked at it.
Did you play, John?
Yes, not very well. I actually, curiously enough, during this lockdown, and I haven't been stuck at home, I've been here in the office every day with my colleagues working at home, but I'm not as busy as I was. I think I've been playing the piano more in the recent months, to tell you the truth. In fact, I know I have, and that's
what are you playing now?
Wonderful. Well, the easier end of the sort of things I used to play, whether it's Chopin or Rachmaninoff or Beethoven or Bartok or you name it. A lot of that kind of thing. But it's depressing not to be able to do something as well as I used to be able to do.
Yeah.
And I don't have time to practice, and I've sort of let it lapse a bit, I must be honest. But I still enjoy it. And if you'll forgive me for jumping around a little bit, we'll come back. I'm not trying to change the subject. I actually think that when you're a critic, it's good to have an idea of what it's like to perform.
Hmm.
I'm not saying that it's necessary, and I'm certainly not criticizing colleagues who haven't performed, although a number have. There's always the danger going to the other extreme that you might get failed performer syndrome among critics, ones who sort of were disappointed they didn't make it. I'm not at all disappointed, but I'm glad that I know what it's like to perform. And you have to remember there's a human being on the other side of the footlights and just know what it involves. And I think that's valuable, but I wouldn't want many people to hear what I play now.
Did you ever, by chance, have the opportunity to rep for an opera rehearsal?
No, more for choruses and choirs, actually. I accompanied a lot of choirs in the townships when I was a student and played for various other large choirs. When I was a student as well, I was the assistant organist in the cathedral in Cape Town, which was an exciting time because I played for Desmond Tutu's enthronement, events like that. And that was an interesting time to be there. So I did a lot of singer and choral accompaniment, but not actually in an opera house or opera company, no.
So John, now you're an editor and a writer. Who are you writing for? Who are you writing to? Pardon me, I used the wrong, that's the wrong connective. Who are you writing to when you write?
Well, I think possibly I would split the answer. I mean, we have a complete responsibility. We have a responsibility to the reader. There's no question about that. And if I'm writing in a specialist magazine or more general publication like a newspaper or something, you do write slightly differently or quite differently. I mean, you assume less or more knowledge and you write differently. I think you always have to bear the reader in mind. That's a courtesy, and after all, if readers don't read you, you won't ultimately get published. But I would actually think that almost our first responsibility, or I feel my first responsibility, is to the art form.
Who are the guardians of the art form?
I don't know about this word, guardians.
Well, think of another word.
I think we all are. I think we all are in a way. I suppose. What I mean about that is, I realize that artists read reviews. In fact, the ones who say that they don't read them on the whole are probably lying. Not all of them, but probably. But that we can't, as critics, tell artists what to do, or we shouldn't be trying. It's certainly not a school report. It's not saying so-and-so should do this next term, could do better next time. It's absolutely not that. And I think any critics who think that are deluding themselves, because, even if I have played a particular piano sonata that I'm reviewing, I still couldn't do it as well as the person I'm criticizing quite harshly, probably. So it's absolutely not that. It is to the art form. And I get a little bit wary, a bit cautious when writers tend to look as if they're sort of cheerleading for particular artists. I don't like to do that. I think we are all cheerleading for the art form, in this case, for opera. And heaven knows it's a difficult situation. So actually, that's the most positive thing we can do, because writing reviews of performances is not always a positive thing. I mean, we all know, it's so subjective. There are no rights or wrongs, but not everybody has a good time all the time. And I would say, and this is a tricky thing. If you have heard a piece, in fact, I'm going to probably take a non-operatic example for a moment because I think it works well. If you have heard a piece like, say, Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, dozens and dozens of times, you might know that you've been to a better performance of it, even if it was still quite exciting. Almost anybody hearing that for the first time would be blown away. And there's always a danger, if you're a critic, of raining on that person's, that reader's parade. and yet you've also got to be honest and say, well, actually, there can be much better performances out there. That's something that you really have to weigh up a bit, and it's not something I'm not proud of always getting those things. Well, I don't think I've always got that right necessarily, but at the same time, you have to write what you think, and you have to be honest, and you have to have some voice and personality. So you can't actually be too. You've got to stick your neck out.
Yeah.
And there is that danger that you will upset somebody because they were blown away by a performance that you didn't actually, you knew you'd heard better of. So it is to the art form.
Yes. I suppose I'm trying to be a bit psychological here, which is devious of me. But I used to have a radio program many years ago in Ireland where I would talk to people about how they ended up doing what they're doing. Right. And I try to focus on technique, how they had the dedication to acquire the technique necessary for them to do what they ended up doing. And a lot of people have a very circumlocucious route to what they're doing. I, for example, and I'm not getting to you psychologically now, so I'm going to try another prong, because I often say in the office to colleagues of mine when they say, "Oh well, we want to do a press release, or we want to do a letter to the audience about the next season," or something like that. And I'm very irritating, John, as I'm sure you know. I always say back, well, there are no general letters. There are no general press releases. If you don't want to get any press, write a general press release. But otherwise, write to people you know, you've come to know, and you respect, in terms that they will respect and understand. And make clear your desires, because you're not fooling anybody. You want print and you want to sell tickets. But also, you might want to communicate something about why you do it, what you want to do. You might want to communicate to the people who don't normally buy tickets, or who might not be inclined to take a punt. So each communication to somebody in the business, in any end of it, and that means buying tickets, writing reviews, performing in, to me, I'm not over passionate perhaps, but I think it's got to be a love letter to what's good about opera, and a statement of where you are in it. There are no objective communications.
No.
A clear sense of where you are in it. And you've chosen this thing, which is unusual. You've brought together a bunch of people who, to the outside, they may seem similar, but they're actually quite diverse. I think you try hard to have diverse voices represented in this strange and wonderful publication. And you also have to keep it a going concern. So I want to get to why you do this. What's so special about you that makes you the person to do this, John?
Nothing is the answer to that. But I could try and tell you what to do, and while also learning from your interviewing techniques, because of course, normally I have to ask the question. It's quite unsettling to be asked the questions. So
that question was too long.
I'm trying to. Well, you'll have to remind me if I'm missing out bits and pieces of it. I mean, the thing is, if we're talking about Opera Magazine, we have. What did you say? Sorry.
Why? Why do you do it, John?
Oh, I enjoy it, and I'm very lucky that I can do something I like. I get a buzz. I get a lot of satisfaction out of it.
Okay. Next question. Okay, next question. Who are you speaking to? Who are you writing to?
Well,
what do you know about and what do you know about your audience?
It's quite a diverse lot, because on one hand we are, if you like, a trade magazine. We're read by opera companies, read by artists, agents, read by artists.
They don't pay.
Indeed. No, all right. But so there's that sort of industry side to it. Then there are the really passionate opera fans, And we do have subscribers who've gone with the magazine right from the first issue in 1950. So it's a very dedicated readership. It's actually often a very knowledgeable readership. But at the same time, if we were only talking to very, very knowledgeable people, we would never discover other new readers. So I think that there has to be a whole sort of multitude of strands going into it. And I think we have very different voices because, well, I mean, there's a feature section, and we commission those features specifically, but also we have reviewers from around the world, literally crisscrossing everywhere from Anchorage in Alaska to Auckland in New Zealand, and in Santiago in Chile to Tokyo and everywhere in between. And everybody writes slightly differently. In fact, in some, I would say there are sort of national tendencies in a way that people write, and different critics in different countries. And I try not to iron that out too much, because otherwise it would be very uniform and very boring. Obviously, the copy needs a certain amount of editing, in some cases, quite a bit, some cases none at all. But at the same time, I think it would be bad to smooth it all out. It's good to have so many different opinions, and I'm very happy for people to say whatever they like, even if I disagree with it. I just think it's about having a discussion, really, and it's about having a discussion about the state of the opera world.
I'm going to pick you up on that. What depresses me about criticism or journalism are those occasions when I feel that we're being informed whether or not it met the expectations of the writer. I think that that's really dangerous, because we have a mature opera audience, by and large, who have been schooled to become very preoccupied with whether or not what they see and hear meets their expectations. And of course, meeting expectations is the epitome of dullness.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, I respect you, and everything I know about you, I like. And I know that you want more than that, and you get more than that, and you encourage more than that. But I just wonder if there's, oh God, I haven't managed to frame this into a question. That's a sign of how inexpert an interviewer I am, because I just wanted to say what I wanted to say. But I just think you've got this role in enriching the experience of the audience, that all of us chaps who have the great privilege, and I say chaps advisedly, of running companies and creating work, we have this privilege and responsibility of enriching the experience of audiences when they come to the opera, not by making shows, but by framing the reference of the shows and responding to the shows, by creating a body of work over time. And I just think, I think it's getting worse. So how do we make it more than meeting expectations? Something's got to happen in performance, doesn't it?
Yes, well, you're making me nervous in that I realize I probably sometimes only deal with expectations. I'm probably guilty of all these things. But I would say that the point of criticism generally, but certainly in something like Opera Magazine, is to have a discussion about the art form. It's to proselytize for the art form, but also to argue for sort of high standards. So that involves expectations. But to come back to what I said, it's not about writing that school report. I think the real danger in criticism, and it happens possibly more in newspapers where arts editors are, looking for a number of clicks and things like that, is there's a tendency to exaggerate. And it's much, much easier. I mean, I know this. It's much easier to write a rave review of something or to absolutely slag it off than to write an honest, middle of the road review that is interesting to read, that's interesting copy. And newspapers in particular tend to like lively copy. And with lively copy comes exaggeration. And frankly, more clicks at the bottom of the piece, and that looks good. But I think we could admit that, talking of expectations, but not hanging on to them too much, that most performances are somewhere pretty respectable. They are not usually life-changingly wonderful, and not usually sort of wrist-slittingly dreadful. They are somewhere in between. And if it's a well-known, fairly standard piece of music, again, I'm thinking a bit outside opera, because so much happens in opera, and that it's always exciting in one direction or another. But shall we say, a standard performance of a Brahms symphony, and I adore Brahms symphonies, but if it's an absolutely standard performance of a Brahms symphony, how is the writer going to write something interesting about that? That is a challenge for writers, and I guess that's where a certain amount of falling back on expectations can happen. But I hear what you're saying, and I take it, and I would say it shouldn't be about well, certainly not all about the critics' expectations. It should be about having an informed discussion, mediating, if you like, between the art form and the public. And in some cases, that public will be, as you say, very, very well informed and very experienced.
Yeah, I mean, yes. I'm thinking of the many pre-performance talks I do, and how exciting they can be, and how generous they can be, and warm on occasion. I was thinking of one time in the Theatre Royal in York, when I met, there was a hardcore of people with with expectations, chiefly expectations of cloaks, and then expectations of outrage and indignation, which many opera fans hold very close to them as an instinctive response to anything that's unfamiliar. And I always think, I'm always thinking, I don't want the rest of the room to tear them to shreds for being so bloody-minded. After all, we're in a place in the world where a lot of people have strong opinions and hold them dearly, and it is a sign of passion and a sign of commitment. How do we shape the discourse in a way that I'm not saying makes way for the new, like, setting an opera in a public toilet? There is absolutely nothing interesting about that, unless it does tell you something about the piece. I'm just talking about, I think it'd be great if somebody wanted to read an opera review that didn't go to opera all the time. And I guess in a newspaper, right, they're trying to sell papers, and they've got very few words. And so it's slam it or bang it, one or the other, or just it drifts into the on-air back pages. Of course, you've got this fantastic, special, difficult position of editing. Yeah, you call it a trade magazine, but I just look at it and think, boy, people would only buy this because they love it. How great is that? Well, as a starting place.
Best advertising agent we've ever had. Thank you. I like that. Oh, James is gone. Well, I think I better talk. Oh, there you are, James. Right.
Some light on the subject. I realized that I'd gone very dark, so I put a little bit of light on because it's later in Italy. So, right, John? How are things going to move so that we are transforming expectations, or we're trying to encourage people to trust the goodwill of people who work in this mad business enough to open themselves to maybe being changed, to changing minds, to how are we going to, I'm going to be specific here because that was all metaphysical. How are we going to convince the editors of the Archers to change their view of opera so that it's not just done in the stately home and sneered at by all the men and esteemed by all the socially aspirant women?
Gosh, that would take a complete revolution. You'd have to close down country house opera, I guess, and anything else that perpetuated the idea that opera is elitist, which of course it isn't, unless one means elite in the sense of being the best possible. best possible. I'm not trying to be particularly antagonistic towards country house opera. I think there's room for everything, but I think particularly in this country, that doesn't help the image of opera, if we're talking about the image of opera and as it seems to editors of the Archers or whatever. I think this awful COVID, and I'm sorry to bring up the subject, we haven't mentioned it yet, tragic, awful situation in which the world finds itself, is also a possible, one of the possible silver linings, and you have to look pretty hard for them, but one of the possible silver linings is that the opera world, the opera business, whatever you want to call it, can, well, look, there are going to be a lot of casualties, and this is awful, but can reinvent itself as well. And I think particularly, I hope I'm right, I hope I'm not naive in thinking that ETO is particularly well placed to do this, because you're not, running a huge venue that you have to, etc. And you're fleet-footed and can do smaller pieces and more flexible, as you've shown. But there are so many opportunities now to do things differently, to do indeed smaller pieces. AIDA doesn't have to be the biggest ever with pyramids and elephants and all the rest. There is an opportunity to rethink the repertoire, to do things that have been neglected, to do them in a different way, if only at the moment out of necessity to get up and running again. Because if you wait until you can do AIDA with elephants and chorus, you might have to wait a long time. So in a way, well, I am grasping at straws. There are not many positive things about the current situation, but I think that if it forces the opera business to look at itself and actually declutter itself a bit, and actually also think about the star system, which let's face it, is not healthy. And I'm not, again, not criticizing people who like stars. There are lots of wonderful stars, but there are lots of less than healthy aspects to this business.
Let's name it. And sadly, sometimes journalism helps to perpetrate it or perpetuate
Absolutely.
it. It's like Gucci handbags. Have you got your Klaus Gut? Have you got your Herheim? Have you got your international collector's rack from the high-class duty-free, rather than, are you building an interesting and creative, artistic hothouse in your own country?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I mean, you're 100% right, and I see this. It's changed a lot in the time, goodness me, about 25 years that I've also been writing for newspapers. In the old days, as you might say, it was very possible to write feature articles, to interview interesting people who weren't necessarily big stars or known for all the wrong reasons. And nowadays, it's very hard to get pieces into newspapers about any of those sort of things. So you're right, that's where journalism doesn't help, and it's also perpetuating that view.
We can't get it into newspapers, and I think that's a lost game. But let's kind of face it, newspapers are a bit of a lost game. So we can be thinking about other ways of talking to creative non-celebrities about the art form in which they work and the art they want to make, which may play a part in, am I just too optimistic, but may play a part in turning opera into something that's not just by dead people?
No, you're not optimistic. And I think the strange thing is, even when I've taken part in discussions or just talked to people personally, but particularly in discussions about the, quotes, current situation, there are lots of optimistic things that come out of this. A few years ago, people would have thought they were being shortchanged if they were sold a ticket to only, shall we say, or just, I should say, Pagliacci, and they'd think it was a short evening. Now people would be sort of on their knees, grateful to go to a performance of an opera lasting 70 minutes. So they're all sorts of things that are changing there. But the optimism aspect, I really, whenever I start talking, I think, I'm an old cynic, really. I mean, I am quite cynical about lots of things. But whenever one starts talking about it or having this kind of discussion, you end up being very enthusiastic. And when I do pre-concert talks or lectures on things, I know I talk very enthusiastically about the music, and that's probably what I do, and what you're doing is to kind of spread the word on the music, I think, and there's no doubt about it. In fact, to come back to talking about criticism, I think that's why I do it, why many people do it. It's because you want to talk about something you love. And a certain amount of optimism and passion can be quite infectious, I think. And if leaders of opera companies like you are showing that and taking your audience with you, if people are excited about what's going on, then it can only be a good thing. And I think opera companies don't need to be in trouble or play things cautiously. We can all think of examples where the seasons are just getting more and more contracted and more and more cautious, if there are seasons. Well, sure, I'm talking about BC times before COVID. But actually, if you have an exciting season, and you can define exciting in lots of different ways, but if you have an exciting season, and that can include something quite small scale and light on its feet, then you will have an audience. I have no doubt about that.
Yes, I think that's true. I mean, I think you know, if you run an opera company, you really have to love your audience. So yes, you love opera, but I mean, if you love opera, fine, just go buy tickets. but you need to love your audience to run an opera company. And sometimes I kind of hear people talking and I think, oh, bloody hell, you're in the wrong post, mate. You need to really, because you need to love those people and you need to demand a lot of them. Not just in terms of shaping an experience so that something new might happen for them, some new feeling might happen. Something might change. I'm not just in love with change, but you know, there might be a reason for paying the money for the ticket. And also, we need to make our audience the evangelists to the new audience. They need to help us find them because we've been crap at it.
Well, it's word of mouth, I guess, what you're saying, and advertising doesn't work. So
yeah, you're saying it in a very plain and sensible way, and I was saying it in a very highfalutin way. But no, but actually, people need to work at it because the opera audience of now will create the next opera audience. It's not going to come in any other way. It will. Do you think that's always die
out? Do you think that's always been true?
No, I don't necessarily, because I think there have been things to do with the social contract in the presentation of opera that have ensured a continuity of audience in a particular class. And I'm not quite sure that those conditions exist now. So I'm optimistic because I think that might mean that I love opera, and as you know, I love a terrible lot of very old opera, but there is a bit of a stuckness. And I think to get ourselves pulled out of that delicious, warm, muddy, rich ditch, it's going to be the audience that needs to move us there by bringing new people. Yes, younger people, but also all kinds of people. People not within that assumed social contract of opera presentation, which hasn't been forever. I just think it has been for a little while. But I'm blathering on too much. It's you that's being.
I'm enjoying listening and getting ideas. I can pinch them and write about them. No, but I think that if anybody knew how to create an audience for new work in an operatic context going forward, they would be onto something. And certainly people are succeeding up to a point. But I realize that it's a huge challenge, and it strikes me as quite ironic because contemporary art does pretty well and is quite trendy, cool, whatever you want to call it.
And contemporary dance.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, that's just blown a hole in my argument, because I was going to say you can walk past contemporary works of art if you don't respond to them. Otherwise, in the theatre, you are stuck there for a certain amount of time. But certainly, there is no reason why new opera shouldn't excite people, and often it does. But I don't think there's enough of it to create that momentum. New pieces are still relatively rare events.
I wonder if sometime it would be worthwhile contrasting the way people write about modern dance and the way people write about opera. Because it might just be that, I'm not saying that the level of discourse is more sophisticated or more inclusive. Sometimes I think it seems to raise a red flag that there's little intellectual content in a deal of modern dance, but that's an opinion and I don't know much about it. But I just think that they're onto something. It's partly because every kid can dance and because that sort of expressiveness is still encouraged in schools, whereas really there isn't. Sadly, there are many people trying, but there isn't that much encouragement in learning the language of music, in being able to read music. Approach to dance is easier, but in a way, of course, going to an opera, it's not that, it's as sophisticated as you want it to be. There's, you can bring all kinds of reference and context and history, and I love all that, but you really don't need it to enjoy the evening. Right. So there's something about, I feel, the discourse of managements and journalists and critics that may, in truth, be inhibiting rather than encouraging.
Well, I obviously need to
That's my theory. What do you?
I obviously need to do a bit of self-examination here, although we always do try to champion new pieces. I guess two things crossed my mind while you were saying that. One is, when you talk about contemporary dance, are you talking about contemporary dance in which the dance language is contemporary, but the music is not contemporary? Because
not necessarily. I mean, there's an awful lot of people that they create the dance and they add the music afterwards.
Okay. Yeah,
and often rather disappointed in the level of the music.
And of course, there is it's far too complicated, and I probably can't express as well in just a couple of sentences. But when contemporary opera in the late 20th century pushed voices to all sorts of unnatural, if exciting, extremes and treated them just like you would treat an instrument. There's obviously been a retreat from that, which is healthy for singers. But at the same time, that has meant that the musical language has become a little bit more conservative sometimes, and that's also right. We don't have to be always pushing that forward. I think when a new composer comes along who really writes excitingly for voices and has something new to say, that's something that everybody recognizes and does get excited about. But I mean, let's face it, it doesn't happen all the time.
No, I mean, we'd have another discussion about the formation of composers, I suppose. And I mean, I teach poetry and I like reading poetry, but there is also something happened to poetry when it became the province of university English departments. And I think the equation of musical language with university departments and difficulty becoming a category of excellence may have something to do with it. It may also be that so many of we producers are slightly removed from commercial pressures to an extent, whereas most of the composers that we admire were flourishing in an exclusively commercial environment. But I'm only just saying obvious things, and I don't have any conclusions. Now, I want to say COVID. Yes. Now, you'll have a much bigger picture on this. I've been just so absorbed with our own situation and aspects of it that are maddening, disheartening, frightening. I hear from freelance artists all the time about how difficult it is to pay the mortgage and to feed children and to have lessons and keep going. Which is not what's happening to those of us who work for opera companies currently. There's an increasing distance there between those with some security and those with none. But I'm very excited about what we're getting to do, because I was thinking, well, we don't have to sell 900 seats, and we can do the things that I think are great that probably aren't going to sell 900 seats this time. And I can hope that those 250 people are going to go out and say, do you know, it was weird, but it was wonderful, so that it does sell 900 seats next time. I mean, I am fiercely optimistic about it. And the idea of getting to stage the Shostakovich romances on English poetry has me up to here with tingling excitement. Because
these are the silver linings. Yeah,
those are the silver linings. They're small, and they're just, I'm afraid they're for me and for the people who are going to be able to come if the theatres are able to open in a socially distanced way and we're able to strike deals. The artists are definitely keen to do it. I had great news the other day that Sue Bickley is going to direct for the first time, and she's going to direct A Waterbird Talk of Dominic Argento with Julian van Mellerts, because I really wanted someone who has done a one-person show, someone who has skills as a performer, communication skills, and also is of a generous nature, as Sue is, and one can see it in her performances, to be a mirror to the performer. Because another thing that I'm excited about in doing monodramas is that this should be an opportunity to say to the performers, you're front and center. I'm engaging people to work with you who are not going to tell you, as I always do, where to put your hand and your foot at every moment, but who are going to interrogate you about your understanding of the text and the music and your ability to hold the stage in the communication of it. So I'm trying to get other performers directing or responding to with dance or responding to visually. Could be terribly corny and bad, but I think there's a chance it might be really good. And strong performers who were going to be in our autumn season and we had to unemploy. So we have been able to find something else for them, doing, stuff they do really well. Julian is a fantastic song singer. And anytime anybody sings a song cycle, they are acting, whether they acknowledge it or not, whether it's the Wigmore style or a different style. So I think there's possibilities, there's opportunities. And I'm dying to get it written about, John, so I'm going to be leaning on you.
That's right. Actually, we've just finished putting together our next issue, and I'm finding that it's filling up fast again. I thought we were going to have to be scratching around for ideas, but we'll always have space for exciting, interesting things like that. So we should be talking soon about that.
I mean, I'm talking to you about that October issue.
I'm very, well, sadly, the October's laid out, but we could scramble something for November. There, I'm on the record saying that, aren't I? That's yes. I'm excited about all this kind of thing, but one has to spare a thought for the metropolitan operas of this world. You can't go around doing monodramas in drafty old halls. Right. I mean, the way in which the opera business picks itself up and starts all over again is going to be very frustrating, very frightening, and very interesting. But I mean, there have been...
How should we change, John?
Sorry?
How should we change? How should it be different? If it's an opportunity to remake, because let's face it, there are a lot of fortresses, great places, great things happen there, but quite resistant to change just because fortresses are.
Well, I think the biggest companies really have the biggest problem, at least in this part of the world and in the US. The ones that are obviously most dependent on box office and have the least state support, because in Germany, for example, opera companies can afford to play to 25% houses and keep going. That's not the case in Chicago or wherever. But it's not only that. I do worry. Well, shall we say? Let me rephrase it, and let me phrase this carefully. I think all opera companies are important, but some appeal to me more personally than others. The really big juggernauty way of doing opera is not something that excites me a lot, but it's an important part of the operatic world. I think they will obviously struggle the most. There's no question. I mean, they are big institutions. They employ hundreds, if not thousands, of people. They need huge audiences. And yet I've been very surprised by the number of green shoots that we've been seeing already. Just a couple of months ago, when planning these issues, I thought we weren't going to have any live reviews until the end of the year. And having just done this layout of the new issue, we've got quite a lot of live reviews, including some in the UK, though obviously as soon as the weather turns, doing stuff out of doors is going to be tricky. But last week I went to a performance in Warsaw of Moniuszko's rarely done opera Hrabina, the Countess. And there was the chorus, and there was an interval. All the trimmings I thought I wouldn't see again for a long time. And there were very, very tough protocols, and everybody had to sign a form and declare that they were healthy and give contact details, and obviously wear masks and all the rest. But I think where there is a vision and determination to do things, and people aren't scared to do things, opera will recover more quickly. I mean, it's very interesting. Italy, as we know, was hit particularly badly by this crisis, and yet there have been more performances in Italy in the last few weeks, months, than anywhere else in the world, and it's shown that opera is important there. In Britain, I'm not so sure. I mean, given that there's complete lack of any leadership apart from apparent scorched earth policies going on here, and there's certainly no arts policy that's discernible. I don't know how the bigger companies will be able to pick themselves up. I pray that they can and that they will, but it's going to take a lot of vision and determination, which I'm not always seeing at the moment.
But just say, John, there's a vaccine. Just say. I know it's probably not until 2021 winter. Should everything go back to the way it was?
No, I think this is an opportunity to rethink, but we shouldn't throw out the old ways either. I don't mean to give you a sort of...
What should be new, John? Come on, put yourself out there. How should it change?
Well, as I said already, I would like to see less reliance on a star system in big houses. Companies thinking along more, shall we say, green lines. And it's not that that I don't want to hear singers from around the world. I do, but and very, very much so. But it wouldn't do opera companies any harm to shop around a little more locally. Not in this case for British singers, because at least until now, Britain has been a very cosmopolitan place. There's singers from all around the world here. But there are singers fantastic artists who live in London, who never work in London. They have to go to Germany or wherever to do it. I was very interested to see Atlanta Opera, which is obviously thinking more creatively than some in the States, has just announced a sort of little, shall we say, bubble company for next season that they will be casting whatever they do, and it's not clear yet what they can do necessarily. Obviously they've got plans from about a dozen, actually some of them really well known, but others are all extremely good artists who happen to live in Atlanta or the Southeast US. And if people start thinking a bit more green in that sense, yes, start thinking about smaller scale things, because big is not always better. It's hard for some audiences, I guess, to accept this because people like the spectacle. But a bit of a re-education is important. And the other thing I would just briefly say, and then I'll stop waffling, is that this whole crisis has shown how vulnerable the art form is, and especially how vulnerable the artists are. And they've been, fallen between all the different furlough schemes and all the rest. I think that it would be, and other people have said this too, I'm not inventing on the spot, that if the economics of the opera business was revisited a bit, and people were perhaps paid some kind of a rehearsal fee per week or something, and then top-ups for performances, rather than it all being in the performances, because if the performances get cancelled or the singers fall ill, they get nothing, obviously. And this is what's happened. People will possibly turn up in a city 6 weeks before an opening night, have expensive travel, expensive accommodation, subsistence. They won't see any money until the run is finished.
It's a strange economics,
all right. I think the economics need to be rethought, and I think they can be rethought. I'm not so sure that it's easy for the very biggest opera houses in the world to do things very differently, but I hope that it's easy for the more medium-sized ones to think more laterally.
I think it's in. I'm
May
sure
I
that
really interrupt, James?
yes, I know, Catherine.
Remind
Yeah.
our friends that if they have any questions and comments, please do put them in the chat now, and John and James will try and answer them best they can. Shall I also use this opportunity to give a little plug about next week? James Conway and Bradley Travis will be joined by director and choreographer Liam Steele, who has done lots of work with ETO, and they'll be discussing his work with ETO and his career up to date, which will be really interesting. Liam is one of the country's most acclaimed physical theatre practitioners, so I think applying that to opera will be a really interesting discussion. Sorry, I really interrupted. And I'll keep an eye on for any questions in the chat.
Yeah, I've been looking at the chat, and I haven't seen a question yet from anyone. So I'm just going to second that if there's a question, because we're already running a tiny bit late. And while someone's typing their penetrating and exciting question, I'm going to just ask John, how do you find the new voices? I'm not talking about on stage. How do you find the new voices for Opera Magazine?
Well, I read a lot. I look for interesting writers, but I'm always open to suggestions from people. I mean, the one thing that really has changed in the ecology of the business is the blogging, is the online stuff. And on one hand, well, there's so many things to say about it, and you would think that somebody who is essentially a print journalist might feel a bit threatened by all the online stuff, because now everybody is a critic, everybody's an expert, it's all free. Quite soon, I guess newspapers will decide they don't need to pay critics because there's enough commentary going on, and as I say, everyone's a critic. There's an awful lot of not very good stuff there out online, and partly maybe it's not even their own fault. There's no discipline online, there's no editing. People can write as much as they like, and whatever one says about newspaper word counts, which are too restricting often, heaven's sake, I often feel that, they force you to focus the mind and express what's really important. So sometimes the online writing can be a bit flabby, but the really good people who've not had a chance to write in newspapers and increasingly going forwards won't have a chance, that's where to find them. And I do often see stuff being written online that I think, gosh, that's interesting, I'd like to have that voice in the magazine, and you try to track them down. I guess I
wonder how you find the people that might not think they were even entitled to have a blog, but that are interesting. That's a tough cake to bake, isn't it?
Yeah, well, yeah, you do have to ultimately be pushy enough to get yourself out there to be noticed. It's the same as how you would discover singers who might have a talent but aren't going to come to audition. It's the same thing, but we're always on the lookout for talent.
You get shy ones at audition who don't know how good they are, and it is, there's something you need to go through to help them to know how good they are, and to bring those. I mean, it's a question, particularly if we want to have more diversity in opera at every level, that we have to somehow, I think, I'm sure you're doing it, and I was genuinely asking because I was thinking you might have some tips for me about, actually diversifying as much as we possibly can. It's funny, I'm going to leave you with something too. It just occurred to me, I met a very eminent critic at a meeting somewhere. Not a pal, because I'm old-fashioned that way. I don't normally make pals out of journalists because I don't want to be asking for favors, I ask for favors all the time, but I don't want to be disappointed if I don't get them, or I don't know. I used to feel really fishy about people even giving drinks to critics at intervals, but other people around me have far more sense than I do. I didn't used to do it in the last company. Yeah, because some people are brilliant at it, and you see them plum-mossing and shining up their apples for all the critics that come to things, and I'd be thinking, holy cow, have a bit of pride. But anyway, I met this guy, and he was talking actually at length. At considerable length. And some of it was quite interesting. And when he finished, I remember saying to him, who are you speaking to? And I just think, now, if I was doing your job, I'd do it very badly compared to you. You do it with excellence. But I think I'd say, one time in 5, who are you writing to? Who is that person? Even for the point of view of getting them to part with, how much does it cost, Opera Magazine?
£6.50, I think, when I last looked at the cover.
Yeah, £6.50 on the rack. Making that decision. Who is it for? Who you're writing to? That's what I feel that's going to give flesh and blood to criticism.
Well, you are 100% right, and I'm probably guilty of not always thinking about that hard enough. I mean, I do think about it, and we value our readers very highly, although I know I irritate some of them with my political views, but I try not to irritate them too much. It's a fine line, but actually we do always have to think of our readers. But I would say one other thing, and I hope this doesn't sound egotistical, that actually I like to put into the magazine things that I find exciting, because if I don't find them exciting, I don't think other people necessarily will. And so it's things, it reflects what interests me up to a point. I think I really have to do that.
You have a very interesting on. So that sounds like the ultimate litmus test to me. I'm just going to relay a question here. What your discourse may have understressed, James, is the wide range of audience members. Some may love opera, but only ever attend once a year. In fact, that's most people who go to opera. I'm putting it in brackets. These people will be real, but not represent a lot of pounds in the bank account, yet they're still part of your community. It is a question of the balance in our style of assessment, pounds or people, your response. Well, I mean, if people are attending once a year, they're an investment, because the easiest target is to get people to come more often, people who've already made the decision to come once. The hardest thing in the world is to get people over the across the threshold that never come. So I don't think it is a choice between pounds or people, to be honest. But I know the person who asked that question, so I think that we can have that discourse another time. How important are opera performances shown in cinemas for the future? Does opera have to be live? Well, I've got views on that, but I think people know them. John, have you got something pithy to say on that subject?
Well, probably not as pithy as you. I'm inclining towards your view of it, because there's just nothing that beats the live experience. And also, of course, opera companies are in danger of cannibalizing their own audiences if they make their wares available at lower price in greater comfort with free popcorn thrown in and all the rest. But I do think that it is wonderful that people can see opera performances from other countries that they might not travel to, especially at the moment. I also think that we're talking, in our case, about people, well, you and I live in London, and there's no shortage of cultural stimulation here, but if you live far away from any of the cultural centres, and I should add, I know that ETO reaches more places than most, but there are still places that don't get opera, but get it in the cinema. So I think there's a place for it, but it's not my favourite way of experiencing opera.
Well, I mean, I'm not. People always misinterpret me about this. I think it's great that it happens. It's just that the audience is the same, only older. There is no evidence that it's making a new audience for opera. So we need to deal in evidence, really, if we're thinking about it. It's not the future, clearly. It's very comforting and a very good thing, and one should take advantage of it. I only get cross when on our one night in a town, there's a clash with a broadcast from another subsidized company in Britain. One can't complain about the Met, but that's just bad planning. And this is the last question because we're already really late, is a future model a permanent company with year-round contracts for artists and only occasional guest stars? Surely we need to reduce air travel, both for climate change and COVID. I don't bring many people in from abroad, and I'm really preoccupied with people who are part of the cultural fabric of the country. Being able to contribute. That's part of the reason why we work with amateur choruses also in a lot of the projects we do. We want to be part of the cultural fabric here. But I think John is already planning to write an editorial on opera companies needing to face the necessity of reducing air travel for climate change and for COVID. I can see a very...
I've done that already. And yes, this idea of a permanent company sounds like turning the clock back, actually, in many cases. I mean, in the 1960s, 70s, that was much more widespread. And I'm not in favor of necessarily going back in time, but I think we could definitely learn from that.
Mm-hmm. John, it's been so good talking to you. You're such a great fellow and you do such an important job. I have very much esteem for you, and I'm sure that all the participants here do. I bet it's a tough job, but I think you keep making Opera Magazine a better thing all the time. So well done, and thank you for taking the time to talk to us.
Thank you, James. It's been a privilege to talk to you, and I admire what you do. So thank you for having me here. It's been wonderful.
Catherine, do you have any last words?
Other than thank you. You've taken the words directly out of my mouth, James. So
I apologize.
I look forward to seeing everyone next week.
All the best, everyone. Thank you so much for being with us. It means the world to us.
All right.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, John.
Thank you. I appreciate that.